He smiled, and the world smiled back. That was how it seemed. Every photograph told the same story, a man traveling the world, visiting cities people only dreamed about, shaking hands with strangers who called him their hero, and sitting at the front row of stages that shone brighter than the sun. From the outside, he seemed untouchable. His life looked perfect, like something out of a movie. But reality, as always, was far more complicated. Every journey began with excitement. He would wake up in a new city, sometimes before the sun, and take a moment to breathe in the unfamiliar air. He would stand by the window of his hotel room, looking at streets that teemed with life, and think about how lucky he was. He loved the thrill of exploration, the smell of fresh bread in a morning market, the sound of waves crashing in a city by the sea, the lights reflecting off glass towers in a downtown he had never visited before. These moments felt like magic, yet, as soon as the door to his room closed, the magic often faded. The applause and smiles were gone. The cameras weren't there. The strangers weren't clapping. In the quiet, he felt the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him. He had been traveling almost non-stop for months, and every day seemed to stretch longer than the one before. Packing was a small nightmare. He had to make sure his outfits were perfect, his hair neat, his luggage organized, and even then, something was always forgotten. A charger, a clean pair of shoes, or sometimes just a piece of himself. Each city blurred into the next, and soon, the names became just labels on a map. He missed the small things: coffee brewed the way he liked it, the corner bakery back home, quiet conversations that weren't rushed or filtered for the camera. He missed mornings where he could simply exist without schedules, deadlines, or expectations. Still, he carried on. He had a role to play. He had learned long ago that people loved the image of him, the man smiling, the man traveling, the man living a life that seemed free from worry. They didn't see the behind-the-scenes moments, and he learned not to show them. A frown or a pause could ruin the illusion, and he couldn't risk that. On the surface, he met people constantly, friends on tours, fellow travelers, fans who wanted nothing more than to be near him for a moment. Conversations were pleasant, but often shallow. He had to keep the energy up, the charm in place, and the smile steady. It wasn't that he disliked people. He didn't, but genuine connections were rare. Almost everyone he met was there to see a version of him that was polished and perfect. There were nights when he would return to his hotel room, the city lights glowing faintly through the curtains, and feel completely alone. He would sit on the edge of the bed, phone in hand, scrolling through messages from family he couldn't call as often as he wanted. Birthdays passed. Anniversaries passed. Milestones in the lives of people he loved went unnoticed because he was in another time zone, another hotel, another city, doing the work that was supposed to make him happy. It wasn't always the distance that hurt. It was the sense that life was moving without him, like a train he had once been on, but now was running beside. He would watch the screen, see smiling faces, and feel a sharp pang of longing. A longing for a simpler moment, a quiet moment, a moment where he didn't have to be anyone but himself. The fans didn't understand. They cheered, they shouted, they took pictures, and they left with smiles that lingered long after he was gone. They didn't know that, after the lights dimmed, the applause ended, and the cameras packed away, there was a man sitting quietly in his room, wondering if the life he had chased was worth the cost. Yet, in public, he smiled. He smiled for the photographs, for the videos, for the people who saw him as larger than life. He smiled because it was easier than explaining. Smiles were safe. Smiles were accepted. Smiles didn't ask questions that nobody wanted to answer. There were, of course, moments of genuine joy. Sometimes, on a quiet morning in a small city, he would wander the streets alone. He would find a cafe tucked into a corner, order a coffee, and sit by the window. He would watch people pass by and let the silence fill him. These were his small victories, moments where he could breathe, even if only for an hour or two. Other times, he found joy in music. He had always loved the way a simple song could reach deep into the soul. And though he rarely had the energy to play anymore, he listened. He remembered the days when he had played for no one but himself, when every note was a conversation between him and the world. Those memories were treasures, small reminders of who he was underneath the traveling, smiling persona. But the pressure never fully went away. Every city demanded something new. Every audience expected perfection. Every stage required energy that sometimes he simply didn't have. There were times when his body ached, when his mind screamed for rest, when all he wanted was a single quiet evening at home. But home was always out of reach. A distant memory that felt more like a dream than reality. Even the simplest tasks became complicated. Meals were rushed, sleep was irregular, and moments of calm were rare. He became a master of routines, a juggler of responsibilities, a performer not just on stage but in every single interaction. And yet, no matter how well he performed, there was a gnawing feeling that he was missing something vital. In the rare, quiet moments, he would sometimes reflect on why he had started this journey in the first place. Was it for the thrill of travel, the applause, the recognition? Or had he been searching for something he could never quite name? Perhaps it was freedom, or peace, or a sense that life could be fully his, and not just borrowed from a fleeting moment on stage. He never spoke these thoughts aloud. They were private, tucked away in corners of his mind where no one else could reach. And yet, they were persistent, reminding him that there was more to life than the surface, more to life than the smiles. One evening, after a long day of travel and appearances, he found himself sitting in the hotel lobby long after the staff had gone home. The lights were dim, the chairs empty, and the only sound was the hum of the air conditioning. He looked around and realized that for the first time in weeks, he felt entirely alone. Not lonely in the moment, but alone in the sense that he was disconnected from the world he was constantly surrounded by. It was a strange feeling. He had traveled thousands of miles, met countless people, yet there was a silence that no applause could fill. He thought of home again. He thought of family and friends, of meals shared, of quiet nights. He thought of laughter that wasn't forced, conversations that weren't planned, and smiles that came naturally rather than as a part of a performance. He wondered if people would understand him if he ever let them in, if he stopped smiling for the cameras, if he stopped performing the version of himself the world wanted to see. Would they still like him? Would they still care? Or would they be disappointed to find a man who was ordinary, flawed, human? He didn't know the answer, and perhaps that was the hardest part. The hardest part was knowing that even when he was surrounded by people, he could feel the distance of a life that wasn't truly his. The hardest part was carrying the image of happiness, while quietly wrestling with exhaustion, longing, and questions that had no clear answers. And yet, despite it all, he smiled again the next day. He put on the clothes, brushed the hair, and stepped onto another stage. He laughed at the jokes, waved at the fans, and posed for the photographs. He smiled because it was what he had to do. He smiled because it was what people expected. He smiled because somewhere deep inside, he still believed that maybe, just maybe, one of these journeys would lead him to something more. Part 1 ends here. Not because the story is finished, but because this was a moment to pause in the whirlwind. The man who smiled for the world, who traveled from city to city, stage to stage, was still searching. He was still hoping. He was still learning that life, even the life that seems perfect, has shadows. And sometimes, the shadows are where we find the truths we need most. The days kept coming, each one feeling like a repetition of the last, yet slightly heavier. He traveled from city to city, airport to airport, hotel to hotel. The lights were always bright, the stages always loud, the applause always constant, and still, beneath the surface, A quiet storm was brewing. He started noticing small cracks in his carefully maintained armor. A moment of hesitation before smiling. A sigh. He didn't bother to hide in the bathroom mirror. A thought that lingered longer than usual. Is this really what I want? The truth was, he had been running not from anything specific, but from the emptiness that came with the life he had built. The applause, the cameras, the strangers' admiration, it had been enough to distract him for years. But now, even the brightest lights could not erase the shadows. Creeping into his mind, it began with exhaustion that no amount of sleep could fix. Flights that once felt exciting now left him drained. Meals felt rushed and tasteless. Even the things he had loved, like wandering streets of a new city or sitting quietly in a park, seemed to lack their magic. The joy was fading, replaced by a heavy, persistent weariness. One evening, he found himself backstage after a show, staring at his reflection in a darkened mirror. The stage lights had faded, the crowd had gone home, and the echoes of applause had vanished. He looked at the man in the mirror, man who had smiled for everyone, who had carried the world's expectations on his shoulders, who had been the perfect image of happiness, and he did not recognize him. For the first time in a long while, he let himself feel, not the performance, not the act of pleasing, not the mask of joy, just him, alone, tired, and deeply human. The emotions he had buried for so long, the loneliness, the longing, the quiet ache for something real washed over him in a way that was almost painful. He remembered the letters he had received years ago, from people who had watched him perform and had been touched by something he did. They had written of hope, of comfort, of inspiration. He had smiled reading them at the time, but now he wondered if the hope they felt had been meant for the version of him he showed to the world, not the man he really was. And suddenly, he felt a longing not to inspire strangers, but to connect with someone who truly understood him. Sleep did not come easy that night. His mind replayed every step he had taken in the last few years, the smiles, the flights, the cities, the stages, the faces. He realized that he had been living a life of motion but not of meaning. He had been moving constantly. Yet his heart had stayed in one place, at home, with the people he loved, in moments that mattered to him personally. The next morning, he decided to do something he had avoided for years. He allowed himself a day off. No interviews, no photographs, no scheduled meetings. Just a quiet day, alone with his thoughts. He wandered the city streets without a plan, taking in sights he had previously ignored. A street musician playing a soft tune, children laughing as they chased each other through a park, the smell of fresh bread from a bakery he passed, the sunlight catching on the windows of buildings, reflecting like a gentle promise. He stopped at a small cafe tucked into a quiet corner. The owner greeted him warmly, without any recognition or expectation. He ordered a coffee and sat by the window, watching people go about their lives. For the first time in months, perhaps years, he felt calm. The weight on his chest had lightened, and he could breathe without effort. It was there, in the quiet simplicity of a single cup of coffee, that he began to understand something important. Happiness was not in the applause, the flights, or the crowded rooms filled with strangers. Happiness was in small, real moments that were genuine, unfiltered, and personal. He realized that while the world loved his performance, he had been starving for authenticity. The following weeks were not easy. He had commitments, appearances, and obligations that could not simply be erased. Yet, he found ways to make space for himself. Morning walks before the city awoke, a notebook where he wrote thoughts no one else would read, phone calls to family he had neglected, even a few quiet conversations with friends who had been patient and understanding. Slowly, these moments became lifelines, small anchors that kept him from being lost in the whirlwind. He also began to notice something else. While the world still loved the smiling, traveling man, People began to appreciate him more when he allowed glimpses of his true self. A conversation with a fan that turned into an honest talk about struggles. A social media post that was real and unpolished. The admiration he received for being perfect had never felt fulfilling, but the connection he found in authenticity was deeply rewarding. There were times of doubt, of course, moments when he questioned whether the sacrifices were still worth it. He still felt the pull of exhaustion, the ache of missing home, the tension of expectation, but now he had tools to cope. He reminded himself that it was okay to pause, to rest, to feel, that his worth was not measured by the applause of strangers, but by the depth of his own experiences and relationships. One evening, after a long day of travel, he stepped onto a quiet balcony in his hotel room. The city below was alive, but he felt detached from the chaos. He closed his eyes and let the wind brush against his face. For a long while, he simply breathed, feeling the rise and fall of his chest. And for the first time in a long time, he smiled, not the practiced smile, not the one for cameras, but a real, small smile. He realized then that life was not about perfection, appearances, or constant motion. Life was about balance. Life was about moments that grounded him, people who cared, and experiences that nurtured the soul. The journey would continue, of course, but he would no longer let it sweep him away entirely. He would hold on to the parts of life that truly mattered. The transformation did not happen overnight. There were setbacks, days of loneliness, moments when the exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him, but each time, he returned to the practices he had begun: quiet reflection, honest connection, and small joys that reminded him of what life was really about. He learned to ask for help when he needed it, to acknowledge his feelings without judgment, and to be present rather than constantly performing. He also began to treasure the simple routines that had been forgotten in the rush of fame: making a cup of tea in the morning, taking a walk without a purpose, listening to a song that made him feel deeply. These routines, mundane to some, became sacred. They were proof that happiness could exist in small, ordinary ways, not just in the grand moments that everyone saw. Slowly, the world began to notice a difference in him, not in the superficial sense, but in the energy he carried. People still admired him, but now there was a warmth in his interactions that hadn't been there before. His smile was more than a mask. It was a reflection of a man who had learned to hold himself gently, even amidst chaos. The greatest lesson he took from all of it was simple, yet profound. It was okay to be human, to feel tired, to miss home, to long for authenticity, to stumble and recover, to smile, not because the world demanded it, but because he chose it. The applause, the travel, the fame, they were part of life, but they were not life itself. Life was the quiet, ordinary moments, the honest connections, the simple joys, and the courage to face oneself. And so, as he traveled to yet another city, yet another stage, he carried something new with him: a sense of balance, a sense of self, a sense that while the world might see the man who smiled and traveled, he also knew the man behind the smile, the man who had found strength in vulnerability, peace in quiet moments, and meaning in the simplest experiences. He understood now that the journey would always be ongoing, filled with challenges and unexpected turns, but it no longer frightened him. He had learned to navigate the storms, to cherish the calm, and to hold on to the truths he had discovered about life and himself. The world still applauded, still cheered, still looked at him with admiration, but now, the applause was not what defined him. He smiled because he had learned to love the man in the mirror, the man who was real, human, and alive, and that, he realized, was the greatest journey of all. Even amidst the bright lights, the bustling airports, and the endless stages, he found peace. He found joy. He found himself. And in that, he discovered the beauty that life had always promised, not in the grand gestures, but in the quiet, ordinary, meaningful moments that truly mattered.